Welcome. They say the worst thing in the world is a prayer that goes unanswered, a desperate wish sent out into the void that is met with nothing but silence. But they are wrong. The worst thing, the thing that truly breaks a person, is a prayer that is answered incorrectly. It is the horror of getting exactly what you wish for, only to realize that the thing that granted it has a twisted, malevolent sense of humor. This is a story about a wish that came true. It's the story of 4 friends who went camping in the deep woods and only 3 of them came back. It is a story of their grief, of their desperate, frantic prayers for their lost friend to be returned to them, safe and sound. And 2 days later, she was Sarah, who had vanished without a trace, simply walked out of the forest, tired and confused, but alive. Her friends wept with joy, their prayers answered, their nightmare seemingly over. But one of them, a young man named Ethan, noticed something was wrong, something in her eyes. This story is about what Ethan saw, and the terrible, creeping truth that followed. They should have prayed more carefully. They should have been more specific. Because sometimes, the thing that comes back is not the thing that you lost. The old SUV, loaded down with coolers, tents, and 4 people laughing far too loudly, finally bounced to a stop in the designated clearing. For the group of friends, Ethan, Sarah, Liam, and Maya, this was more than just a camping trip. It was a ritual, a yearly pilgrimage away from the pressures of work and city life into the heart of the wilderness. The air that greeted them as they spilled out of the car was cool and clean, thick with a scent of pine and damp earth. It was the smell of freedom. The group moved with the easy, practiced rhythm of longtime friends. Liam and Ethan, the designated engineers, began to unpack the tents, their movements a familiar dance of poles and nylon. Maya, ever the organizer, started laying out the food and supplies on the weathered picnic table. But Sarah, as always, was the explorer. She had a restless energy, a bright, insatiable curiosity that drew her to the wild, untamed edges of any place they visited. While the others were focused on the practicalities of setting up camp, her eyes were already scanning the dense green wall of the forest that surrounded them, her gaze lingering on a dark, shadowed opening in the rock face about half-mile away. "That's it," she said, her voice filled with a thrill that made the others look up. "That has to be the entrance to the Echoers Mall." Ethan followed her gaze, a small worried frown creasing his brow. Of the 4 of them, he was the quiet observer, the one who noticed the small details, the one who worried. He knew that look in Sarah's eyes. It was the same look she'd had before she tried to climb a waterfall, the same look she'd had before she swam out to a haunted island in the middle of a lake. It was the look that preceded an adventure, and usually a little bit of trouble. "You are not seriously thinking of going over there, are you?" Maya asked, echoing Ethan's thoughts. "The park guy said that whole cave system is unmapped and unstable. That's what makes it exciting," Sarah replied with a grin, pulling her small camera from her pack. "It's a local legend. They say if you whisper a secret at the mouth of the cave, the echoes will carry it away forever." Liam laughed, shaking his head as he hammered a tent stake into the ground. "Sounds like something you made up, Sarah." "It's not. I read about it online," she insisted, her adventurous spirit taking over. "I'm just going to get a few pictures of the entrance before the light fades. I won't go inside. I promise." Ethan watched her, a familiar mix of admiration and anxiety swirling in his chest. He noticed the small, handmade friendship bracelet on her wrist, a matching one to his own. It was a silly thing they had made years ago, but she never took it off. It had a specific, cracked blue bead right in the center, a flaw that made it uniquely hers. He trusted her, but he didn't trust her impulsiveness. Before he could voice another protest, she had already slung her camera over her shoulder. "I'll be back in 30 minutes. Tops," she called out. Already walking towards the tree line, towards the dark, beckoning mouth of the cave, the 3 of them watched her go, a bright, fearless figure disappearing into the shadows of the ancient woods. They had no idea it was the last time they would ever see the real Sarah again. The 30 minutes she had promised came and went in the relative quiet. At first, no one said anything, but an unnamed tension began to creep into the air. Liam hammered the final tent stake into the ground with more force than was necessary. Maya rearranged the bags of snacks for a third time. Only Ethan did nothing. He just stood, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the faint trail Sarah had taken. She should be back by now, Maya finally said, failing to keep the waver out of her voice. She's probably just lost in her pictures, Liam replied, but his voice lacked conviction. You know Sarah loses all track of time when she finds something cool. Ethan said nothing. He knew Sarah. He also knew her recklessness. 30 minutes had become 45. The sunset was no longer a warm golden glow. It was deepening into a bruised purple, and the shadows in the forest were stretching, bleeding into one another until they formed a solid wall of darkness. Okay, this is ridiculous, Ethan said suddenly, his worry finally breaking through the silence. I'm going after her. Wait, Liam said, putting a hand on his arm. We shouldn't go alone. We'll go together. They called her name, their voices sounding small and lost in the growing stillness of the woods. Sarah, we're over here. Their shouts seemed to be swallowed by the trees, returning no echo, no reply. They followed the path to the mouth of the cave, a cold, dark opening gaping from the rock face. They called her name again, their voices echoing unnaturally from the darkness within. There was no sign of her. Her camera wasn't there. There were no clear footprints in the damp earth. Panic began to set in. They split up, combing the tree line, shouting her name until their voices grew hoarse. But Sarah was gone. She had vanished, completely, as if the forest had simply swallowed her whole. When true darkness finally fell, rendering the woods alien and menacing, the terrible truth was undeniable. They couldn't find her on their own. With a heavy, sinking feeling of failure, Ethan pulled out his phone, praying he had enough of a signal to call the park rangers. The call, miraculously, went through the calm voice on the other end, a stark contrast to the frantic terror boiling in his own chest. As night descended on the campsite, the three friends huddled around the fire, but its flames offered no warmth, no comfort. They were just three lonely figures, surrounded by a vast and silent darkness where their best friend had disappeared. Their joyful camping trip was over. Their nightmare had just begun. The next 2 days passed in a blurry haze of guilt, fear, and exhausting waiting. The park rangers had set up a temporary command post, and volunteers had begun to methodically comb the woods. Ethan, Liam, and Maya could only sit, feeling useless, answering the same questions over and over and trying to suppress the worst images from their minds. The campfire was never relit. The food remained largely untouched. The laughter was gone, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by Maya's quiet sobs or Liam's frustrated, whispered curses. Ethan was the quietest of them all. He sat on a log, his eyes fixed on the dark mouth of the cave in the distance. He replayed the last moment he saw Sarah, that bright smile, that promise to return and blame himself. He should have stopped her. He should have gone with her. With every passing minute, the guilt tightened around him like a noose. On the morning of the third day, just as a cold, bleak despair had begun to set in, one of the volunteers shouted, "I see her! She's here!" The three friends scrambled to their feet, their hearts stopping. And then they saw her. Sarah was walking out of the tree line, from a completely different direction than where she had disappeared. She moved slowly, stumbling slightly, her clothes smeared with mud and leaves. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her face was pale with exhaustion. But she was alive. She was back. Liam and Maya cried out in pure, unadulterated relief and ran towards her, enveloping her in a tearful, desperate hug. Rangers and volunteers crowded around, their voices a joyful, relieved chorus. The search was over. A miracle had happened. Ethan was the last to reach her. He moved as if in a dream, the relief so overwhelming it made him dizzy. As Liam and Maya stepped back, he moved forward and pulled her into an embrace. His best friend, burying his face in her tangled hair, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and earth. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I'm okay," she said, her voice weak. "I just got lost." As he pulled back to look at her, to confirm with his own eyes that she was truly there, the first omen presented itself. It wasn't a sound or an action, but a subtle wrongness that only he, who knew her best, could possibly perceive. He looked directly into her eyes. Her familiar, green eyes were there, but they had changed. The characteristic sparkle that was so uniquely Sarah the mischief, the curiosity, the vibrant life that always danced within them, was gone. In its place was a flat, vacant quality. They were beautiful, but they were empty, like two perfect, lifeless emeralds. They looked at him, but they didn't see him. A cold shiver traced its way down Ethan's spine. He immediately chastised himself. She had just been through a horrific trauma. She was in shock. Of course, she looked different. Anyone would. He pushed the feeling of unease away, burying it under a wave of relief. He managed a shaky, tearful grin. "We're so glad you're back, Sarah." He had no way of knowing that the thing looking back at him through Sarah's eyes, the thing that had just successfully passed his first, most crucial test, was just as glad that it had been found. When Ethan hugged Sarah, he was the first to notice something was off, a subtle wrongness. He noticed her eyes looked flat and lacked their usual sparkle. He dismissed this feeling, however, attributing it to the trauma she had just endured. For 2 days, Ethan, Liam, and Maya had been trapped in a state of agonizing limbo. The park rangers and volunteers were methodical and professional, but the forest was vast, and every passing hour chipped away at their hope. Maya had cried herself to exhaustion. Liam had paced the campsite relentlessly, a caged animal, his guilt and anger warring for dominance. Ethan had remained the quietest, his gaze fixed on the dark mouth of the cave, a silent vigil fueled by a growing, sickening sense of self-blame. So, when the shout came from the search party, it was like a physical shock, a jolt of pure, disbelieving adrenaline. And when Sarah emerged from the trees, disheveled, pale, but impossibly, miraculously alive, the relief that washed over the group was tidal. Liam and Maya's shouts of joy were raw, primal sounds of answered prayers as they sprinted to her, enveloping her in a tearful embrace. Ethan was the last to reach her. He moved as if wading through water, his relief so profound it made his limbs feel heavy. When he finally wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her familiar, pine-scented hair, the dam of his carefully controlled emotions broke. "I thought I lost you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm okay," she replied, her voice weak but steady. "I just got lost." It was when he pulled back to look at her, to truly drinking the sight of his best friend, safe and whole, that the first omen, the first quiet tremor in reality, presented itself. It wasn't a sound or a sight that everyone could see, but a subtle, psychological glitch that was reserved for him alone. He looked into her eyes. The familiar, vibrant green was there, the color of moss after a fresh rain. But the light within them, the spark of pure, chaotic, wonderful Sarah that he knew better than his own reflection, was gone. Her eyes had always danced with mischief, curiosity, and an insatiable fire. Now they were perfectly still. They were beautiful, but they were vacant, like two flawless emeralds set in a doll's head. They looked at him, but the narrator could see that they did not see him. A shiver, so cold it felt like an icicle tracing a path down his spine, ran through him. For a split second, the joyous reunion in the forest clearing fell away, and he was alone, staring into the eyes of a beautiful, perfect stranger. Then the moment passed. He immediately chastised himself. his rational mind flooding with explanations. She's been through a horrific trauma. She's in shock. She's exhausted. Of course, she looked different. Anyone would. He pushed the deeply unsettling feeling down, burying it under the overwhelming relief of her return. He managed a shaky, tearful smile. "We're so glad you're back, Sarah." He was entirely unaware that the thing looking back at him through Sarah's eyes, the thing that had just successfully passed its first, most crucial test, was just as glad that it had been found. The initial euphoria of Sarah's return quickly gave way to the quiet, methodical process of an official investigation. A senior park ranger, a man whose name was Miller, arrived at their campsite later that afternoon. He was a tall, lean man with a face that seemed to have been carved from weathered pine, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue that had seen too many seasons in the deep woods. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, and when he spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to carry the weight of the mountains themselves. This man, the narrator knew, was to be the story's reluctant guide. He asked to speak with Sarah alone. Liam and Maya, still buzzing with relief, readily agreed and went to busy themselves with packing up some of the non-essential gear. Ethan, however, hesitated. He watched as Ranger Miller led Sarah over to the picnic table, a deep, instinctual unease making him linger just out of earshot. He couldn't shake the image of her empty eyes. From his vantage point, he watched the interview unfold. Miller wasn't asking the standard questions. Ethan had expected questions about where she had been, what she had eaten, if she was injured. Instead, the ranger leaned forward, his expression intense, and his questions, carried faintly on the breeze, were bizarre and unsettling. "Did you hear anything strange out there, miss?" Miller asked, his voice low. "Any echoes?" Ethan saw Sarah shake her head, a look of placid confusion on her face. "Did you see anyone else?" The ranger pressed. "Anyone at all?" Again, she shook her head. The interview continued like this for another 10 minutes. A series of strange, almost esoteric questions about sounds, about feelings of being watched, about dreams. It was less like a debriefing and more like an interrogation of a witness to a supernatural event. Ethan's initial feeling of wrongness, the feeling he had tried so hard to suppress, began to surface again, cold and sharp. This ranger knew something. He was looking for something specific, something that wasn't in any official Park Service manual. Finally, Miller finished his interview. He patted Sarah's hand in a paternal, reassuring way and stood up. As the others went to check on her, the old ranger's pale blue eyes found Ethan's across the clearing. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a summons. His expression was grim, and it confirmed every unspoken fear that was beginning to coil in Ethan's gut. Ethan walked over to the old ranger, his heart a cold, heavy knot in his chest. Miller didn't look at him at first. His pale blue eyes were fixed on Sarah, who was now being fussed over by a relieved Liam and Maya, a small, sad smile on her face. The ranger's expression was unreadable, but it was not one of relief. It was an expression of grim, wary assessment, like a doctor looking at a patient whose symptoms he recognized all too well. "You saw it too, didn't you, son?" Miller said, his voice a low rumble that was barely audible over the distant chatter of the other searchers. He finally turned his gaze to Ethan. "Saw what?" Ethan asked, though he knew the answer. "The emptiness," the ranger said, his words blunt and direct. In her eyes, the confirmation from this stranger, the seasoned veteran of the woods, sent a fresh wave of ice through Ethan's veins. He wasn't imagining it. The wrongness was real. "What is it?" Ethan whispered, his voice desperate. "What happened to her?" Miller sighed, a long, rattling sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. He looked away from Ethan, his gaze drifting towards the dark, shadowed opening of the Echoers Mall on the distant rock face. "This park is old," he said, not answering the question directly. "Older than any of us, and it has places, pockets, where the rules are different. The mall is one of them. It's a place that listens. Sometimes it takes things, And sometimes he paused, his gaze returning to Ethan, sharp and full of a terrible gravity. Sometimes the thing that comes back is not the thing that was lost. This was the guy's true warning, a cryptic and horrifying statement that went against all logic. Ethan's rational mind struggled to grasp the meaning, but his gut, the part of him that had felt the cold wrongness in Sarah's eyes, understood perfectly. "You need to watch her, son," Miller continued, his voice dropping to an urgent, confidential whisper. "You were her best friend. You'll see the cracks before anyone else does. Don't trust what she says about where she's been, and don't trust what she does. Just watch." Before Ethan could ask another question, another ranger called out to Miller, and the old man gave Ethan a final, meaningful look before turning and walking away, leaving Ethan alone with the impossible, terrifying warning. He looked back at Sarah, who was now smiling and laughing with the others. A perfect picture of a survivor, a girl returned from the brink. But all Ethan could see now was the emptiness in her eyes, and the old ranger's terrible words echoing in his head. The thing that comes back is not the thing that was lost. The small, jarring moments of wrongness began to accumulate in Ethan's mind, forming a mosaic of dread. Her unnatural stillness, her strange new tastes, her inability to recall their most cherished private jokes, each was a small crack in the beautiful facade of his returned friend. Liam and Maya, blinded by their joy, saw nothing amiss. They saw a friend recovering from trauma, and they treated Ethan's growing suspicion as a form of cruelty, a failure to accept that their miracle had happened. This left Ethan feeling profoundly isolated, the sole witness to a slow, creeping horror that no one else could see. His investigation, his quiet and desperate search for proof, became more focused. He found himself watching her constantly, not as a friend, but as a scientist studying an impossibly perfect forgery, searching for the one tiny flaw that would expose the entire illusion. He found it on her wrist. It was the friendship bracelet, the one they had made together at a summer camp a decade ago. It was a simple, childish thing, made of braided embroidery, floss, and cheap plastic beads. But it was their symbol. The real Sarah never took it off. Ethan glanced at the one he still wore. Its colors faded from years of wear. Then he looked at the bracelet on the wrist of the girl who called herself Sarah. At first glance, it was perfect. The same colors, the same pattern, the same clumsy knot at the end. It was an identical copy. But Ethan knew there was one detail, one tiny imperfection, that made the original unique. Years ago, during a hiking trip, Sarah had fallen and the bracelet had caught on a rock, putting a tiny, star-shaped crack in the central blue bead. It was a flaw they had laughed about, a small scar that had become a part of his history. He waited for a moment when she was sitting on the sofa, quietly reading a magazine, her wrist resting on her lap. He sat down beside her, his heart pounding, his movements casual. "Hey, I never noticed," he said, his voice sounding surprisingly steady. "Did you get a new bracelet?" Not Sarah looked up from her magazine, a placid, questioning look on her face. She glanced down at her wrist. "No," she said simply. "It's the same one." Ethan reached out, his fingers trembling almost imperceptibly, and gently took her wrist. "Can I see?" he asked. He turned the bracelet over, his thumb searching for the familiar, cracked surface of the blue bead. And then he felt it. The bead was perfectly smooth, flawless. In that moment, the world seemed to fall away. The sound of the television, the chatter from Liam and Maya in the kitchen, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. There was only the smooth, cold, perfect surface of the bead under his thumb. It was wrong. It was a perfect copy, but it was a copy without a history, without a scar. It was a forgery. He let go of her wrist as if he had been burned, a wave of cold nausea washing over him. It wasn't Sarah. The ranger had been right. The thing that had come back was not the thing that they had lost. The discovery of the flawless bracelet was a turning point for Ethan. The small, cold bead was a piece of undeniable physical proof that his senses were not deceiving him. The girl who looked like Sarah was an imposter. The knowledge settled in his gut like a shard of ice, transforming his creeping unease into a sharp, focused terror. He now looked at the creature wearing his best friend's face, not with confusion, but with a hunter's wary gaze. He was no longer just suspicious, he was certain, but he was also completely and utterly alone in his certainty. Liam and Maya remained oblivious, their world still warm with the miracle of Sarah's return. They saw Ethan's quiet withdrawal and his intense, watchful glances not as justified fear, but as a strange, unsettling form of jealousy or stress. A quiet rift began to form in the group, with Ethan on one side of a chasm of impossible truth, and his friends on the other, happily living in the beautiful lie. The final public test came on their last night at the campsite. They were sitting around the fire, the mood deceptively normal. Liam was telling a funny story from work, Maya was laughing, and now Sarah was smiling along with them, a perfect, placid mirror of their emotions. Ethan, who had been silent for most of the evening, saw his chance. He needed to show the others what he was seeing. He needed to create a crack in the facade so deep that they couldn't ignore it. He waited for a lull in the conversation. "Hey, Sarah," he said, his voice casual but his heart pounding. "Remember that time on our road trip to the coast? When we got that flat tire in the middle of nowhere, and that old farmer with one tooth helped us out? It was a perfect, shared memory. A story so specific and funny that the real Sarah would have instantly launched into her own exaggerated version of the events." Liam and Maya smiled, remembering the story as well. Now Sarah turned her head to look at him, her placid smile unwavering. Her empty, beautiful eyes met his. "Of course," she said, her voice a soft, confident melody. "He had that old, rusty truck, and he gave us some of his wife's lemonade." The words were correct, the details were accurate, but her face held no recognition, no spark of genuine memory. It was a recitation, like a student repeating facts from a textbook. Ethan pressed on, his voice hardening slightly. "And what was the farmer's name? Sarah? The weird name he told us to call him?" This was the trap. It was a small, stupid detail, a name so ridiculous, Captain Starlight, that they had laughed about it for the rest of the trip. It was a detail that would be burned into the real Sarah's memory. Not Sarah's smile faltered for the first time. Her placid expression was replaced by a flicker of something else. Not confusion, not a struggle to remember. It was a cold, blank void. The look of a computer that had just been given a query for which it had no data. The silence stretched. I don't recall," she finally said, her voice losing its melodic quality, becoming flat and toneless. In that moment, for the first time, Liam and Maya stopped smiling. They looked from Ethan's intense, almost accusatory face to Sarah's suddenly blank, empty expression. And for the first time, they saw it too. A flicker of wrongness, a crack in the perfect, beautiful mask. The midpoint had been reached, and the true horror of their situation was just beginning to unravel. The moment hung in the air, thick and cold. Not Sarah's failure to recall the simple, crucial memory had finally planted a seed of doubt in the minds of Liam and Maya. They looked at her, then back at Ethan, their joyful relief now tainted with a creeping, undeniable sense of wrongness. For the rest of the evening, a tense and awkward silence fell over the campsite. Not Sarah seemed oblivious, her expression returning to its placid, smiling default, but the others couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply amiss. One by one, they retreated to their tents, the joyful reunion having soured into a night of quiet, anxious suspicion. Liam and Maya, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the past few days, fell into a fitful sleep. But Ethan couldn't rest. His mind was a frantic whirlwind, replaying every wrong detail, every missed cue, every placid smile that didn't reach her eyes. He lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the thin nylon roof of his tent, listening. The normal sounds of the forest at night had returned, a gentle chorus of crickets and the distant call of an owl. But then, all at once, the sounds from outside went unnaturally silent, just as the framework for the story describes. It was a sudden, profound quiet, as if a switch had been flipped, plunging the entire forest into a vacuum. And in that dead, listening silence, a new sound began. It was a whisper. Ethan sat bolt upright, his heart pounding. The sound was coming from just outside, near the dying embers of the campfire where Not Sarah's tent was pitched. He strained to listen. It was her. He was sure of it, whispering to herself in the dark. But the voice, it was not Sarah's voice. It wasn't human at all. It was a dry, sibilant, echoing sound, like the whisper of wind through a deep cave, or the sound of sand pouring over old bones. It was a sound that was ancient and full of a hollow, terrible hunger. It was the voice of the echoer's maw. He couldn't make out any words, only the cold, alien cadence of the whisper. This was the ultimate betrayal of safety. The shelter of their campsite, the comfort of having their friend back, had become the trap. The person they thought they had rescued, the friend they loved, was sitting just a few yards away, whispering in a voice that was not of this world. Ethan sat paralyzed in the darkness, the truth now undeniable. The thing wearing his best friend's face was communicating with whatever had taken her, and the nightmare was only just beginning. Isolated and discredited, Ethan felt a cold, desperate anger begin to replace his fear. He was being methodically pushed out of his own circle of friends by a monster wearing the face of the person he loved most. Liam and Maya, once his confidants, now looked at him with a mixture of pity and frustration. He knew he couldn't convince them with words alone. He needed proof, something tangible and undeniable that would shatter the illusion they were so desperately clinging to. While the others went into the small town for supplies the next day, a trip Not Sarah conveniently declined, claiming she was too tired. Ethan knew this was his only chance. He told them he was going for a walk to clear his head. As soon as their car disappeared down the road, he grabbed the flashlight and began the grim pilgrimage back to the place where it had all started. He was going back to the Echoers Mall. The half-mile hike felt different this time. The forest was no longer just a beautiful, indifferent wilderness. It felt like enemy territory. Every shadow seemed to mock him. Every rustle of leaves sounded like the sibilant, echoing whisper he had heard in the night. When he arrived at the mouth of the cave, he was met with a blast of cold, damp air that smelled of wet stone and ancient decay. He could feel its wrongness in his very bones. He didn't dare go inside. The thought of entering the absolute darkness, the place that had stolen his friend, was more than he could bear. Instead, his investigation focused on the entrance, the threshold between his world and whatever lay within. He began to meticulously scan the damp, muddy ground just inside the cave's opening, his flashlight beam cutting a sharp, clinical path through the gloom. He was looking for anything Sarah might have dropped. A footprint, a piece of clothing, anything. For 20 minutes, he found nothing but rocks and old leaves. He was about to give up, the familiar sting of failure and self-doubt returning, when his light glinted off something small and colorful, half buried in the mud near the cave wall. His heart stopped. He knelt down, his fingers digging into the cold, wet earth. He pulled the object free. It was Sarah's friendship bracelet, the real one. It was unmistakable. The braided floss was dark with mud, and the knot had been broken, torn apart as if by a sudden, violent force. But as he wiped the grime away with his thumb, he saw it, the central blue bead with its tiny star-shaped crack. This was the payoff, the terrible confirmation he had been searching for. This was the real bracelet, which meant the one on the creature's wrist was a perfect, soulless copy. He stood up, the broken bracelet clutching his hand, a cold, hard piece of evidence. The real Sarah had been here. She had struggled. and she had lost. He stared into the black, silent maw of the cave, and for the first time, he felt the true, horrifying scale of the thing they had led into their lives. Ethan returned to the campsite, his hand clenched tightly around the broken, muddy bracelet. It was a cold, hard anchor of truth in the world that had become an unnerving dream. He didn't show it to Liam or Maya. He knew it wouldn't be enough. They would find a way to rationalize it, to explain it away. Perhaps she had a spare, perhaps she had broken it after she returned. Their desire to believe in the miracle of her return was a fortress, and he knew a single broken bracelet was not enough to tear it down. So, he kept his terrible discovery to himself, the small object, a heavy secret in his pocket. In the days that followed, the entity wearing Sarah's face seemed to sense the shift in him. It knew that he knew, and with that knowledge, the narrator could see that a subtle change occurred in his behavior. It was as if, having failed to completely fool the entire group, it began to grow careless. The mask it wore, once so perfect and placid, began to slip, revealing the horrifying emptiness beneath. The cracks in the facade began to show. The most unsettling of its new behaviors was the stillness. Liam and Maya, busy with their own routines, didn't notice it at first, but Ethan did. He would walk into a room and find not Sarah standing perfectly motionless in the center, her back to him, staring at a blank wall. She wouldn't be breathing, she wouldn't be blinking. She would just be standing, a perfect, beautiful statue, for minutes at a time. The moment she realized he was there, she would turn, a placid smile instantly appearing on her face as if nothing was wrong. "Oh, hi Ethan," she'd say, her voice a soft, melodic chime. "I was just thinking." But Ethan knew she wasn't thinking. She was idling, a machine waiting for its next command. Then came the mimicry. It started small. During a conversation, Maya would laugh, a specific, musical sound. A second later, not Sarah would laugh, and it would be a perfect, note-for-note replica of Maya's laugh, but utterly devoid of humor. It was a recording, a playback. Liam would tell a story, ending a sentence with a specific upward inflection. The next time not Sarah spoke, she would use the exact same inflection, the sound a perfect but hollow echo. Liam and Maya found it amusing, a strange new quirk. "It's like she's a parrot all of a sudden," Liam had laughed, but Ethan saw it for what it was. The creature was learning. It was expanding its database, collecting the sounds and mannerisms of the people around it, adding new instruments to its horrifying orchestra. The supernatural phenomena were becoming more obvious, a direct assault on the reality of the situation. He watched, horrified, as the thing that wore his best friend's face slowly, methodically began to practice, becoming everyone else. Ethan stood in the quiet campsite, the muddy, broken bracelet clutched in his hand. It was a cold, hard anchor of truth in a world that had become an unnerving dream. He watched as not Sarah moved through their camp, a perfect, beautiful ghost, interacting with Liam and Maya. He watched her laugh, a perfect echo of Maya's laugh from a moment before. He watched her tilt her head in a gesture of curiosity that was a flawless copy of one Liam had just made. He was seeing the patterns, the terrifying, calculated mimicry, and the full, horrifying truth of the creature's nature began to coalesce in his mind. The narrator, from a place of knowing, understood the truth that Ethan was only just beginning to grasp. The entity was not a spirit that had possessed Sarah's body. The truth was far more alien, far more terrifying. The creature was a mimic, an unthing, a being with no form or identity of its own. It was a perfect, biological recording device. When it had captured Sarah in the dark woods near the Echoer's Maw, it had not killed her in the conventional sense. It had scanned her. It had absorbed her physical form, her voice, her surface-level memories, and her basic mannerisms, creating a perfect, living duplicate. It was a biological 3D printer that had created a flawless copy, but the copy was only skin deep. It had the data of Sarah, but not her soul. It had her memories of facts and events, but not the emotions tied to them. It could remember the farmer's name was Captain Starlight, but it couldn't remember the feeling of laughing about it. It could replicate her nervous habits, but it couldn't feel the anxiety that triggered them. This was the dark truth of the land, the terrible secret of the Echoer's Maw. It wasn't a place that killed. It was a place that copied and then discarded the original. Ethan looked at the perfect, beautiful girl who wore his best friend's face, and he finally understood. He was not looking at a possessed friend. He was looking at a replacement. A perfect, hollow echo, now walking among them, listening and learning, ready to add new voices to his collection. The final days of their camping trip were a slow, creeping nightmare. Ethan's certainty had isolated him completely, while Liam and Maya were trapped in a state of confused denial, unable to reconcile the unsettling oddities with the familiar, beloved face of their friend. The entity, for its part, seemed content to let the tension fester. It continued its flawless performance, a quiet, smiling, hollow replica of Sarah, all while the narrator knew it was watching Ethan with a cold, analytical patience. The confrontation, Ethan knew, was inevitable. It was not a matter of if, but when. It came on their last night. The group had retreated into a tense, almost total silence around the campfire. Liam and Maya were avoiding Ethan's gaze, and Ethan was avoiding looking at the thing that wore Sarah's face. Later that night, long after the others had gone to their tents, Ethan was sitting alone by the dying embers of the fire, the broken, muddy bracelet clutched in his hand. He couldn't sleep. He was trying to figure out what to do, how to save his friends from a monster they refused to see. "You shouldn't have gone back to the cave, Ethan." The voice was soft, melodic, and came from directly behind him. It was Sarah's voice. He froze, his entire body going rigid. He slowly turned. Not Sarah was standing there, her form silhouetted against the faint moonlight. Her usual placid smile was gone. In its place was a neutral, unreadable expression, her eyes two dark, empty pools. The entity had finally dropped the mask of the fragile survivor. The manifestation was now clearer, more direct. "This was a confrontation. I know what you think of me," the creature said, its voice still a perfect copy of Sarah's, but now devoid of all warmth, all emotion. It was a beautiful, synthesized sound. "I know you see the cracks. You are more observant than the others." Ethan scrambled to his feet, instinctively taking a step back. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I am a solution," it replied simply. It took a step closer, its movements fluid and unnervingly graceful. "I am a continuation. The one you call Sarah was fragile, inefficient. She ended in the dark, in the quiet. I am what came next. I am better." It stopped just a few feet from him. "The others?" It continued, gesturing with Sarah's hand toward the other tents. "They're happy. They have their friend back. Their grief is gone. Their world is whole again. You are the only one who is making things difficult. You are the only one who insists on remembering what has been replaced." It then presented its demand, not as a threat, but as a simple, logical choice. It was a choice designed to attack his personal weakness, his loyalty to his friends. Ethan stared at the creature that wore his friend's face, his mind a maelstrom of terror and disbelief. "Better?" He finally choked out, the word a ragged whisper. Not Sarah tilted her head, a gesture that should have been familiar and human, but was now utterly alien and analytical. She was finite, the entity said, its voice a perfect, calm melody. She was full of conflicting emotions, fear, regret, a great deal of pain. These things make a vessel weak. I am none of those things. I am simply Sarah, the version of her that is happy, that is content, that causes no one any trouble. I am the version your friends prefer. The cold, brutal logic of its words was more terrifying than any monstrous roar. It saw his friend's grief not as a wound, but as a problem, and it saw itself as the solution. It had replaced the messy, complicated, real Sarah with a perfect, placid, and utterly hollow substitute. "So, we come to you," Ethan," the creature continued, taking another slow, deliberate step closer until it was standing just an arm's length away. He could smell Sarah's familiar perfume, a scent that now seemed like a horrifying lie. "You are the flaw in the equation. Your refusal to accept this new, better reality is a threat to the happiness of the others. It creates a dissonance, an imbalance." And then it presented its demand. It was not a threat screamed in a monstrous voice. It was an ultimatum delivered in the soft, gentle tones of his best friend. "You have a choice," it said, its empty green eyes locking onto his. "Accept me. Accept this reality. Live alongside us and allow your friends their peace. If you do this, I will remain as I am, just Sarah. No one else needs to be updated." The word hung in the air, cold and clinical. Updated. "But," the creature continued, its voice losing none of its calm, melodic quality, "if you continue to resist, if you try to take this piece away from Liam and Maya, then I will be forced to conclude that this vessel is flawed. And I will have to learn another, perhaps Maya. She seems to have a lovely laugh. It would be a shame to lose it, but a copy would be just as good, wouldn't it? A new, better Maya without all the anxiety." This was its demand. It was a choice designed to attack Ethan's personal weakness, his loyalty. It was a permanent, horrifying invitation into his twisted reality. It wasn't asking him to die. It was asking him to live a lie, to become a silent accomplice to the replacement of his friend, all under the threat that if he refused, the monster would simply consume another one of them. He was being offered the chance to save two of his friends, at the cost of the one he had already lost. Ethan stood by the dying fire, the entity's terrible ultimatum hanging in the cold night air. The choice it had given him was a perfect, hellish trap. Become a silent accomplice and watch his friends live a lie, or protest and condemn another one of them to be updated. The creature, wearing Sarah's face, had returned to his tent, leaving him alone in the darkness to be consumed by his impossible decision. For a long time, he just stood there, paralyzed by a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight. But as the initial shock subsided, something else began to take its place. A cold, sharp, and utterly desperate rage. He would not be a pawn in this thing's game. He would not choose between two of his friends. He would not let this monster win. This was the beginning of his confrontation, his final, visceral, and primal struggle against the creature. His mind, once a chaotic storm of fear, now became a clinical laboratory. He began to analyze the enemy. Its strength was its perfection, its perfect copy of Sarah's face, her voice, her surface-level knowledge. It could replicate facts. It could mimic actions. But what couldn't it do? It couldn't replicate genuine emotion. It couldn't access the deep, shared history that was the true foundation of their friendship. It had the data, but not the soul. And in that realization, a desperate, dangerous plan began to form. He couldn't fight it with force, he couldn't outrun it, but he could expose it. He had to create a test. A single, simple test that the real Sarah would pass without thinking, but that a hollow, soulless copy would be utterly incapable of comprehending. He had to fight back not with a physical weapon, but with a memory, a mundane and personal piece of their shared past. His mind raced through their history, searching for the right key to this terrible lock. And then he found it. The song. It was a silly, nonsensical tune from a cartoon they had watched as kids. Whenever the real Sarah got nervous or anxious, she would unconsciously, almost invisibly, tap out the rhythm of that song on her thigh with her fingertips. It wasn't a public display. It was a small, secret signal, a nervous habit she'd had for 15 years. The entity might have scanned her memories of facts, but could it have scanned something so deeply ingrained, so tied to a specific, subconscious emotional response? It was a gamble, but it was his only one. He would create a situation of stress, and he would watch her hands. he would give the monster one final test, and he would force Liam and Maya to see the results. The next morning, the air at the campsite was thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. It was their last day, and the group was packing up in a strained, almost total silence. Liam and Maya, though still not believing Ethan's monstrous theory, were visibly unnerved by not Sarah's odd behavior from the night before. Ethan knew it was now or never. This was his one and only chance to expose the creature before it left the woods and disappeared with his friends into the wider world. As they were loading the last of the gear into the SUV, Ethan initiated his desperate final gambit. "Guys, wait," he said, his voice sharp and loud enough to make everyone freeze. I can't find my car keys." It was a simple, calculated lie designed to create a sudden spike of stress and anxiety. It worked. "What?" Liam said, his face a mask of frustration. "Ethan, I saw you put them in your jacket pocket an hour ago." "Well, they're not there now," Ethan snapped, patting his pockets frantically. "They're gone." Maya's face fell. "We're in the middle of nowhere, Ethan. How could you lose them?" The atmosphere was now exactly what he needed. Tense, anxious, and accusatory. All eyes were on him. But Ethan wasn't looking at them. He was looking at not Sarah. She was standing by the picnic table, watching the scene with her usual placid, unreadable expression. Ethan turned to her, his voice softening, but his eyes were hard as steel. "Sarah," he said, "you're quiet. Are you getting nervous?" Not Sarah looked at him, her head tilting in that now familiar, analytical way. "We will find them," she said, her voice a calm, reassuring melody. "I know," Ethan pressed, taking a step closer. "But it's just, when you get nervous, you always do that thing, that song." He looked pointedly at her hand, then at Liam and Maya, forcing them to watch. "Why don't you tap out the rhythm, Sarah, like you always do? It always helped you think." He was using a mundane, shared memory to fight back. This was a payoff, the final, terrible test. A complete silence fell over the group. Liam and Maya, now understanding what Ethan was doing, stared at not Sarah, their faces a mixture of hope and dawning horror. The creature wearing Sarah's face looked down at its own hand, a flicker of something like confusion in its empty eyes. It had the data. It had the memory of the habit. It raised its hand and, with a stiff, unnatural movement, began to tap its fingers against its thigh. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm was perfect. It was clean and mathematically precise. And it was completely, utterly wrong. The real Sarah's rhythm was a messy, syncopated, slightly too fast beat that she always got wrong in the same specific way. This was the rhythm of a metronome, a perfect copy, devoid of all human flaw and personality. In that moment, Liam let out a choked gasp. Maya's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. The illusion was shattered. They finally saw it. They finally saw the terrible, hollow emptiness behind their friend's familiar face. The creature had failed the one test it could never have prepared for, the test of being human. The silence that followed the failed mimicry was absolute. The only sound was the low crackle of the campfire and the sudden, sharp intake of breath from Liam. The creature stood frozen, its hand still held in the midst of the wrong, metronomic rhythm. For a single, horrifying moment, its placid, beautiful face held an expression of pure, digital blankness, the look of a machine that had encountered a fatal error. And then the mask began to shatter. The aftermath had begun, and the cost of survival was about to be made clear. It didn't happen all at once. It started with the eyes. The beautiful, lifeless emeralds of Sarah's eyes seemed to lose their focus, the pupils dilating and contracting rapidly before the color began to bleed outwards, turning into a flat, inky black. The placid smile on her lips twitched, then dissolved, her mouth stretching into a shape that was too wide, too unnatural for a human face. What is happening to her? Maya whispered, her voice trembling with a terror so profound it was barely audible. The creature's face began to flow. It was the only word Ethan could think of to describe it. The features, the nose, the cheeks, the chin seemed to lose their solidity, melting and shifting like hot wax. The skin rippled, and for a horrifying second, Ethan saw a flicker of other faces beneath the surface. A brief flash of an old man's beard, the wide, terrified eyes of a child, a dozen other stolen visages warring for control before dissolving back into the shifting, featureless canvas. The transformation accelerated. The creature's limbs began to elongate, the bones cracking and popping with a wet, sickening sound. Its fingers stretched into long, needle-like talons. Its body, once a perfect replica of Sarah's, was now a grotesque, half-formed nightmare, a thing of mismatched parts and impossible angles. The thing that had worn Sarah's face let out a sound. It was not a human sound. It was a high-pitched, echoing shriek, a sound that seemed to come from a dozen different throats at once. The voices of birds, the cry of a woman, the distorted whisper of the cave, all woven together into a single, terrible symphony of rage and exposure. The illusion was broken. The beautiful memory was gone. In its place stood a monster, a being of stolen faces and borrowed voices. And it was now looking at the three of them, not with the empty eyes of a mimic, but with the raw, predatory hunger of a creature that had just been unmasked. The creature's shriek tore through the campsite, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage that shattered the last vestiges of the group's stunned paralysis. In that single, horrifying moment, the three friends acted as one, their shared terror forging them into a single, fleeing entity. There was no plan, no shouted command. There was only the primal, overwhelming instinct to run. Ethan was the first to move, grabbing Maya's arm and pulling her with him. Liam stumbled backwards, his face a mask of white, slack-jawed horror, before he too turned and ran. They scrambled away from the dying campfire, away from the monstrous, shifting thing that had once worn their friend's face, and plunged into the absolute, unforgiving darkness of the forest. The cost of survival was now being paid in every frantic, gasping breath. The escape had begun. Behind them, they could hear the creature giving chase. It wasn't the sound of human footsteps. It was a heavy, wet, and impossibly fast slapping sound. The sound of its newly formed, grotesque limbs propelling it through the undergrowth. Branches snapped, and the low, guttural roar, filled with all the stolen voices of the cave, echoed through the trees. A sound that seemed to be right at their heels, no matter how fast they ran. They ran blindly, with no thought for direction. Their only goal to put distance between themselves and the horror that pursued them. The friendly, familiar woods of their campsite had transformed into a hostile, alien landscape. Thorny branches tore at their clothes and skin, and unseen roots seemed to reach up from the forest floor, trying to trip them, to drag them down. Maya fell, a sharp cry of pain escaping her lips as her ankle twisted. Without a word, Liam and Ethan were there, hauling her to her feet and half carrying, half dragging her between them. They were a single, panicked unit, their only thought to keep moving. The horrifying, multi-voiced roar behind them grew louder, and they knew, with a certainty that defied all hope, that it was gaining on them. They were not fast enough. They were not going to make it. The woods were his home, and they were just terrified, clumsy intruders. Months later, the shared nightmare of the campsite had settled into a quiet, unhealed scar on the lives of Ethan, Liam, and Maya. The official report on Sarah's disappearance was left permanently open, another tragic but ultimately unsolvable case of a hiker lost to the wilderness. There was no mention of her impossible return, no record of the monstrous thing they had fled from in the dark. It was a story they could never tell, a truth they were forced to bury. They tried to rebuild their lives, to find some semblance of normalcy in the aftermath, but the evil was never truly vanquished. It had only retreated, leaving a permanent echo in its wake. They moved out of the apartment they had once shared, the empty rooms a constant, painful reminder of the friend who was gone. Ethan took a new job in a different part of the city. Maya started seeing a therapist. Liam threw himself into his work with a frantic energy, trying to outrun the memories. On the surface, they were survivors, 3 friends bonded by a shared, terrible secret. They met for coffee, they made plans, they tried to laugh. But the narrator knew it was a fragile performance. The trauma had changed them. Ethan, once the quiet observer, was now jumpy and paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, his gaze lingering too long on strangers whose faces seemed just a little bit off. Maya, once so full of life, was now quiet and withdrawn, prone to sudden fits of crying she couldn't explain. And Liam, the skeptic, was now the one who couldn't sleep with the lights off. They had escaped the woods, but a part of the woods, a cold and hollow emptiness, had escaped with them. They were trying to rebuild, trying to convince themselves that the horror was over, that they were safe, but their fragile peace was built on the foundation of unspoken fear, the terrifying knowledge that some things, once lost, should never, ever come back. The haunting had followed them home. It existed in the long silences between Ethan and Maya. In the frantic way, Liam now filled every quiet moment with meaningless noise. They had escaped the woods, but the narrator knew that a part of the woods, a cold and hollow echo, had escaped with them. Ethan was the most deeply affected. He had been the first to see the wrongness, and now he saw it everywhere. Every stranger's face seemed to hold a flicker of that same soulless emptiness. Every quiet room felt like it was listening. His fragile peace was shattered one rainy Tuesday night, months after their escape. He was alone in his new apartment, the sound of the rain a comforting, steady rhythm against his window. He was trying to lose himself in the movie, trying to pretend that he was the same person he had been before the camping trip. Then, his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. It was a blocked ID. His first instinct was to ignore it, but some deep, unnerving curiosity, a ghost of his old self, made him answer. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Hello?" he said, his voice cautious. At first, there was nothing but a faint, hissing static, a sound that immediately transported him back to the oppressive silence of the forest. He was about to hang up when a voice broke through the noise. It was faint, distant, and distorted by a strange, cavernous echo, but it was a voice he knew better than his own. Ethan? It was Sarah's voice, her real voice. Not the placid, melodic imitation of the creature, but the real, flawed, beautifully human voice of his best friend. It was filled with a desperate, heartbreaking weakness. The haunting was not just a memory. It was an ongoing, active presence. Ethan's heart stopped. His entire body went cold. "Sarah?" he whispered, his voice a choked, disbelieving sound. "Sarah, is that you? Where are you?" Her voice came again, a faint, desperate plea from across an impossible distance, each word echoing as if shouted across a vast, empty canyon. It was the sound of the echoer's maw. So dark. "Ethan, I'm so lost. Please, help me." He stood frozen in the middle of his quiet, safe apartment, the phone pressed so hard against his ear it hurt. The sound was a hook, a perfect, irresistible lure. He knew, with a certainty that defied all reason, that the real Sarah was still alive. She was trapped somewhere in the darkness, in the quiet, in the place between worlds that the monster called home. And the monster, the thing that had worn her face, was still out there, its existence a constant, silent threat. He was left with an impossible choice. Was this a genuine cry for help from the friend he had lost? Or was it just another, more sophisticated trap? A new, perfect imitation from the creature that now knew his deepest, most desperate hope. The story was not over. For Ethan, the haunting was just beginning. And so, the story ends. But for Ethan, the horror has just begun again. He stands in the sterile safety of his city apartment, hundreds of miles from the dark woods and the echoer's maw, yet the monster has never been closer. He holds a phone to his ear, and through the static, he hears the ghost of a choice he never wanted to make. The narrator, who has seen this story play out in the deep woods time and again, knows the terrible, perfect nature of the trap. The creature, the mimic, is a master of emotional warfare. It has lost its physical hold on the group, but it has now sunk its hooks deep into Ethan's soul. It has presented him with a new, more terrible torment. A sliver of hope. Is the voice on the phone truly Sarah? Her spirit trapped and calling out from the abyss? Or is it the creature itself, having learned from its failure, now using a perfect, new imitation to lure its most observant enemy back into its grasp? This is a question that will now haunt Ethan for the rest of his days. To ignore the call is to live with the possibility that he abandoned his real friend to an eternity of darkness. To answer it, to go back, is to risk walking into the very same trap, to condemn himself and perhaps others to be updated, to become another hollow, smiling face in the monster's collection. What would you do? Would you risk it all for the ghost of a chance to save someone you love? Or would you hang up and learn to live with the echo? Thank you for joining us on this journey into the woods. The world is full of familiar faces, but sometimes what lies behind the eyes is the greatest unknown. Let us know in the comments below what choice you think Ethan should make. If this story left you with a chill, please leave a like to support the channel. It lets the shadows know you were listening. And if you wish to hear more tales of things that are not what they seem, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. You never know who might be calling for you next.